It was a land of rich kingdoms and proud peoples. But in the late 19th century, a new power arrived on its shores, determined to claim its resources and control its destiny. This is the story of a conquest, a story of resistance, of leaders who rose and fell, and a people's long, arduous journey from colonial subject to a free nation. Resistance leaders Séméry Touré and Félix Houphouët-Boigny. How did Ivory Coast break free from one of the world's most powerful empires? The answer is a tale of strategy, sacrifice, and the unyielding spirit of independence. Find out more in our documentary. How are you, friends? I am Czar. Welcome to Episode 8 of the French Conquest of Ivory Coast. Earlier, we discussed other North African countries. The people of Ivory Coast, or Ivorians, are not a single homogeneous group. Instead, they are a diverse tapestry of more than 60 distinct ethnic groups, each with its own language, customs, and history. The origins of these peoples are complex, stemming from centuries of migration into the region from various parts of West Africa. Historians believe that the earliest inhabitants of the area were likely displaced or absorbed by the ancestors of the current population, who primarily migrated southward before the 16th century. These migrations were often spurred by the rise and fall of great Sudanic empires to the north, such as the Ghana, Mali, and Songhai empires, as well as conflicts and the desire for new agricultural land. There are four major ethnic groups in Ivory Coast. The Akan are the largest ethnic cluster in Ivory Coast. Their ancestors began migrating into the region from the east, in what is now modern-day Ghana, between the 17th and 18th centuries. This movement was largely a result of the expansion and internal conflicts of the powerful Ashanti Empire. The most prominent Akan groups in Ivory Coast are the Baoulé in the central region and the Agni or Anyi in the east. Other groups include the Abron. The Baoulé have a famous oral tradition detailing their exodus from Ghana, led by the legendary Queen Abla Poku, who is said to have sacrificed her son to cross the Kamoe River. The Gur-speaking peoples have ancient roots in the area, with some groups having lived there for centuries. Their history is closely linked to the pre-colonial kingdoms and empires of the Sahel. The most significant Gur group is the Senufo, who are concentrated in the north around the city of Korogo. Other groups include the Lobi and Kulango. The Senufo are considered one of the region's oldest continuous inhabitants. Their ancestors fled the centralizing and Islamizing influence of the Mali Empire to settle in their current homeland, where they established a strong agricultural society known for its distinctive art and music. The Mande peoples are found in the northwestern and western parts of Ivory Coast. Their history is deeply connected to the Great Mali Empire, a center of trade, scholarship, and power in West Africa from the 13th to the 16th century. The Mende are divided into two main branches, primarily the Malinke and the Bambara. They are descendants of the core populations of the Mali Empire. Southern Mande includes groups like the Dan, or Yakuba, Guro, and Gban. Their migrations into the forested western regions occurred over a prolonged period. The Diula, or Yula, a subgroup of the Mande, are historically merchants and traders who spread throughout West Africa, establishing famous trading posts like the city of Kong in northern Ivory Coast. They played a crucial role in the spread of Islam and commerce along the trans-Saharan trade routes. The Kru peoples are indigenous to the southwestern forested regions of Ivory Coast and neighboring Liberia. They are believed to be among the earliest inhabitants of the West African coast. This group includes the Bete, Dida, Gere, or Way, and Bakwe. Unlike the other groups whose origins are tied to large inland empires, the Kru peoples have historically lived in smaller, decentralized societies in the dense forest belt. Oral traditions suggest they migrated from the interior of what is now Liberia to the coast. They became renowned for their maritime skills and were often hired as sailors and mariners by European trading ships, which is how the term crewman is sometimes thought to have originated. In summary, the Ivorian people have diverse origins, representing a confluence of migrations from across West Africa over many centuries. This rich history of movement and settlement has created the complex and multicultural society that exists in Ivory Coast today. The French push into Ivory Coast was driven by two main ambitions: economic exploitation and geopolitical competition. The region was rich in valuable resources that were in high demand in Europe. Initially, trade focused on commodities like palm oil, timber, and ivory. Later, the French aimed to establish large-scale plantations for lucrative cash crops, particularly coffee and cocoa, which they could produce cheaply using local labor. This colonial economic model was designed to extract raw materials for French industries and create a captive market for French manufactured goods. By the 1880s, a fierce rivalry had erupted among European powers to claim territory in Africa. Not wanting to be outdone by Britain, Portugal, and Belgium, France engaged in an aggressive expansionist policy. Claiming territory like Ivory Coast was a matter of national prestige and strategic advantage. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, which formalized and accelerated this process, compelled France to establish effective occupation over the areas it claimed to prevent other powers from moving in. The French conquest of Ivory Coast was not a single event, but a protracted process that unfolded over several decades. France's first foothold was established in 1842 when Admiral Louis-Édouard Boîte-Willemez signed treaties with local kings around Grand-Bassam, establishing a French protectorate. For decades, French control was limited to a few coastal trading posts with little authority inland. Starting in the 1880s, explorers and diplomats like Louis-Gustave Binger were sent to venture inland. They signed numerous treaties with local chiefs, often through manipulation or by exploiting local rivalries. These treaties were then used to legitimize French claims over vast territories. When diplomacy failed or local rulers resisted French encroachment, military force was used. From the 1890s onward, the French launched a series of brutal military campaigns known as pacification. The French faced fierce and prolonged resistance from various groups. The most famous opponent was Samurai Touré, a Mandinka leader who created the Wassoulou Empire and fought the French for years until his capture in 1898. French colonial troops, often composed of soldiers from other African colonies, the Tirailleurs Senegalais, systematically defeated local armies, burned villages, and crushed any opposition to solidify their control. By 1893, Ivory Coast was officially declared a French colony, but military campaigns to subdue the entire territory continued for nearly 2 more decades. This combination of economic ambition, geopolitical rivalry, and military force ultimately enabled France to establish its colonial rule over the nation. The Catholic Church in colonial Ivory Coast primarily acted as an instrument of the French civilizing mission, working closely with the colonial administration, while the French army committed significant crimes, most notably through the brutal system of forced labor and violent military campaigns of pacification. The main goal of Catholic missionaries was to convert the indigenous population to Christianity. This process was often linked to the policy of assimilation. The church was responsible for establishing the first Western-style schools in the colony. However, this education was limited and designed to create a class of low-level clerks, interpreters, and assistants for the colonial administration and French businesses. It was not intended to foster critical thinking or empower the broader population. The church and the colonial state had a symbiotic relationship. The administration provided protection and support for missionary activities, viewing the church as a tool for pacifying the population and instilling loyalty to France. In return, the church rarely, if ever, challenged the colonial hierarchy or its abuses, instead preaching obedience and acceptance of French authority. The church acted as the soft power arm of the colonial state, promoting cultural and religious changes that complemented the military and economic subjugation of the Ivorian people. Gang rape was employed as a deliberate weapon of war. It served to humiliate entire villages, punish resistant communities, and shatter social and familial bonds. These acts were a brutal assertion of power, demonstrating the conqueror's absolute control over the bodies of the colonized. Ivorian women had no effective way to report these crimes. The legal system was designed to protect the colonizers, not the colonized. The immense social and personal shame associated with rape prevented many women from ever speaking about their experiences. While official colonial archives may be silent on the matter, The consensus among historians who study the violence of colonialism is that sexual assault and gang rape were systemic tools of terror and subjugation used by the French colonial regime in Ivory Coast. Much of the evidence that exists today comes from the oral histories of communities that have passed down the stories of the violence they endured during the colonial period. The French army's presence was defined by violence and exploitation, aimed at suppressing resistance and extracting wealth. Forced labor, the conditions were inhumane. Laborers suffered from malnutrition, disease, and extreme physical abuse. Those who resisted or tried to escape were often beaten, imprisoned, or killed. The system led to a massive loss of life, destroyed local economies by pulling men away from their farms, and caused widespread social disruption. The initial conquest and subsequent suppression of rebellions were extremely violent. The French army conducted brutal military campaigns to crush resistance from leaders like Sémoury Touré and to subdue various ethnic groups who opposed colonial rule. These campaigns involved the burning of entire villages, the destruction of crops to induce famine, the execution of resistance leaders, and the indiscriminate killing of civilians. The principle was one of collective punishment, where entire communities were held responsible for the actions of a few. This brutal approach was intended to terrorize the population into submission and ensure a stable environment for economic exploitation. The independence movement in Ivory Coast grew out of decades of deep-seated grievances against the French colonial system. Led by a pragmatic and strategic elite, the movement navigated a complex political landscape to achieve sovereignty in 1960. The primary problems during the colonial era were the catalyst for the rise of nationalist leaders and their organized push for freedom. The movement began not as a call for outright independence, but as a demand for rights and equality. The pivotal figure to emerge was Félix Houphouët-Boigny, a well-educated Bolé chief, doctor, and wealthy planter who experienced the injustices of the colonial system firsthand. Building on the success of the SAA, Houphouët-Boigny co-founded the PDCI as the Ivorian branch of a wider intercolonial political party, the Rassemblement Démocratique Africain, RDA. The PDCI became the primary vehicle for Ivorian nationalism. In its early years, it was radical and faced severe repression from the French authorities. After a period of intense French pressure, Houphouët-Boigny made a strategic decision to sever ties with the French Communist Party and cooperate with the French government. This pragmatic shift allowed him to negotiate for greater autonomy and rights for Ivorians from within the French system. He was elected to the French National Assembly and even served as a minister in the French government, using his position to advance the cause of his people. Houphouët-Boigny successfully campaigned for Ivory Coast to vote yes, accepting Charles de Gaulle's proposal for the country to become an autonomous republic within the newly formed French community. He believed this path offered stability and continued economic aid from France. On August 7, 1960, the Republic of Ivory Coast was proclaimed, and Félix Houphouët-Boigny became its first president, having led his nation from the fight for farmers' rights to full sovereignty without a war of liberation. Following its independence from France on August 7, 1960, Ivory Coast experienced a period of remarkable economic prosperity, often termed the Ivorian miracle. However, this success masked deep-seated structural problems that would later plunge the nation into decades of instability. The country's first president, Félix Houphouët-Boigny, established a one-party state under his Parti démocratique de la Côte d'Ivoire, PDCI. While this provided stability for nearly 3 decades, it suppressed all political dissent. Free speech was curtailed, and opposition was either co-opted or crushed, preventing the development of democratic institutions. After Houphouët-Boigny's death in 1993, a toxic concept of ivorité, Ivorianness, was promoted by his successors, notably Henri Konan Bédier. This nationalist ideology aimed to define who was a true Ivorian, primarily targeting Northerners, many of whom had ancestry from neighboring countries like Burkina Faso and Mali, as well as political opponents like Alassane Ouattara. This policy dangerously deepened ethnic and regional divides. Tensions over land ownership between native groups and migrants, both from other parts of Ivory Coast and from other countries, who were often encouraged to work on cocoa plantations, have been a persistent source of local and national conflict. As of recent data, there are approximately 70,000 to 100,000 Ivorian nationals and French citizens of Ivorian descent residing in France. This figure includes both immigrants born in Ivory Coast and their direct descendants born in France. The infrastructure built by France was purely to serve French interests. France has not paid anything in compensation in return to Ivory Coast. The first official diplomatic ties between France and Ivory Coast were established immediately on August 7, 1960, the very day Ivory Coast declared its independence. The first country to recognize Ivory Coast as a sovereign nation was France. This was demonstrated by the new nation's swift admission to the United Nations on September 20, 1960. From violent invasion to peaceful independence, the journey of Ivory Coast is a testament to the enduring quest for sovereignty. The French colonial era left deep scars, but it couldn't extinguish the Ivorian spirit. We've covered the conquest and the road to August 7, 1960, but the story is far from finished. If you learned something new today, please hit the like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next video. Thanks for joining me.